Hi everyone, my name is Laura and I'll be talking about UI or user interface today. So hope this is informative. And okay, I'm going to start with an outline of what this lecture is going to cover. So we're first going to cover UI and we're going to talk about what it is, 4 types of UI, general advice for UI. And then I'm going to go into UX. So this is how UX is influenced through UI and also how we can design UI to affect UX. So let's start with what is UI. Here are some examples. So first of all, we have a screenshot from League of Legends. And as you can see, there's a mini map. There's several different characters and symbols and health bars, just numbers, symbols, things you can interact with, and also special effects. These are all part of UI. And so next we have a screenshot from Teamfight Tactics or TFT. And once again, all of these little icons and symbols and numbers, everything is also UI. And even this, a screenshot from Genshin Impact. As you can see, there's more special effects, more mini maps, symbols, than things that you can interact with, health bars. All of this is UI. So if all of the previous are UI, then what exactly is it? How do we define it? So defined, it's user interface. So it's a space where a game and the user interact. And so basically it informs the user and guides the experience of the game. And every game has UI because it's exactly how a player interacts with the game. And if it doesn't have UI, the player can't interact and it's not a game. So every game has UI. So here's a basic chart for UI components. So depending on whether something is in the game space or in the game story, we can categorize it into 4 basic types of UI. And we're listing them here. There's non-diegetic, spatial, meta, and diegetic. So all these terms might not make too much sense right now, and that's totally fine, but I'm gonna go into each of these and kind of explain what being in the game space or being in the game story means. So to start off, what we have is non-diegetic. And as we can see, hopefully my camera doesn't block the little chart that we have in the corner, but we're starting off in the first quadrant. And this is non-diegetic, which means that it's not in the game story and it's not in the space of the game. So no characters are aware that this component exists. And so these types of components exist only for you, the player. And some examples of non-diegetic elements are a number for points and something like the time. And we can see examples of this in Mario Kart and in Pac-Man. So moving on, we have some more examples of UI outside of the game that's also considered non-diegetic. So we have things such as the life meter or the health of something in Super Smash Bros. And also the level map. So this all makes sense because the characters don't interact with these elements. They're just here to inform us. So next we have the bottom right quadrant, which is diegetic, which means that it's existing in the story and existing in the space of the game. So characters in the game are aware of these types of components. And an example is in this GIF for GoldenEye 007. And part of the game is interacting with your watch to look at a menu and weapon, as shown in this GIF. So UI existing inside of the game story and the game space. Some examples, these are usually futuristic overlays. So in Team Fortress 2 on the left, we can see how much time he has left on his watch. And on the right is Dead Space. So you can tell his health based on the left bar thing. And so the next category we have, or the quadrant, which is up here in the right, is called spatial. So this is where it's not in the game story, but it is in the game space. So spatial components are visuals used to help the players, and characters usually don't see these as well, but they're very helpful and they point out important landmarks, or it can be things like usernames, because as we can see in Among Us, usernames are associated with things in the game space, such as characters, but characters usually don't interact with them, and they're used to help you as a player guide you around the map that's in the game. And for example, if the reactor was called in this Among Us game, we would also see a gigantic flashing arrow, and that would also be considered a spatial component. So some more examples of UI existing exclusively in the game space are from Breath of the Wild. There's a little arrow over the places that you have to go. And in Resident Evil 2, there's an arrow telling you where and what to interact with. So usually these help to guide the player. And the last quadrant that we have is meta. So these components exist in the game story, but not in the game space. And so these usually indicate to the player that something is going on, and this is very usually damage, and it's mainly used for immersion. And these are a little bit harder to define, but here are some more examples of UI only existing in the game story. So again, usually these are special effects that immerse the player. And so as we can see in this first GIF, there's a flash of lightning, and it's really there to help immerse the player by creating things that are, they are, as we can see from the last slide, they're in the game story, but not in the game space. And yeah, so these special effects are usually part of the UI, but also, like, for example, if we blind a character, it's just there for immersion and just still considered part of UI. So to give a quick recap of the quadrants that we covered, we have non-diegetic, spatial, meta, and diegetic. And so these are broad categories that UI components can sort of fit into. And yeah, so moving on to some general tips for UI. First, we have keep your UI meaningful and simple. So there is nothing wrong with complex UI, but if the player can't understand the UI that you're making, then how can they stay immersed in the game? Again, it's really hard to focus if there's a lot of distracting things going on. And we want a game that's easy to learn and hard to master. And so having a clean UI can be a really great gateway to following this rule of thumb. And Undertale does this really well by having UI components that are simple, but each component has a specific purpose. And so it's very straightforward. It's a really great example to follow. And moving on, we don't want to overwhelm the user. This is kind of tied with the first one, where, for example, in this screenshot from Universalis Europia 4, it's a little bit hard to figure out what's going on because the UI is a little bit overwhelming. There's so many different things to look at. You're not exactly sure where to look. And, for me, when I see this, I'm like, what's going on? And something that we noticed in UI in strategy, MMO, and RPG games is that they're usually more complex and they have a higher learning curve to understand. So if you can, in your games, then please try to avoid overwhelming UIs so that you could streamline your gameplay experience and make it so that it's more accessible to everyone. And something to note is that UI is not strictly defined. So I mentioned the 4 broad categories of UI, but there are actually ways that you can sort of move around that. And an example of this is in Baba Is You in this little GIF on the left. So this game is showing how you can change the game flow based on what you do. So originally you're this character, but by pushing the word rock and changes the sentence to rock is you, you can essentially sort of become the rock and start moving and controlling that. And on the right, we have a screenshot from Dance Dance Revolution. And so in this game, you're strictly interacting with the UI rather than the ways that other games may have with like a character. And so this is another creative way that you can sort of step out of the boundaries of, the classic UI examples. Cool. So now we're going to do breakout rooms. And so we'll discuss a UI that you like or a UI that you absolutely despise, and identify which category each element or elements of this broad game that you're talking about falls under in these categories that we talked about. So once again, there's non-diegetic, spatial, meta, diegetic, depending on whether it's in the game space or in the game story. And I think Jasmine would, assign breakout rooms at this point, but since this is a recording, I'm going to move on. So this is going to be delving into UI and UX. So the user experience, or UX, so user experience is what UX stands for. And user experience is dictated by the UI. It can either immerse players or it can drive players away. So on the left, we have a picture from, these 2 pictures are from Journey and from Breath of the Wild, and they both have really great user experience because, as you can see, it's just very welcoming and just very pleasant to look at. And so user experience, UX, is driven by gameplay, graphics, UI, and audio. So it can be kind of thought of as the vibe of the game. And so on the right, we have a very minimalistic look with like very little UI, but this is what makes Journey beautiful and an amazing adventure. But UI is also something that can make a game feel terrifying. And so, for example, Resident Evil is scary because of how minimal the UI is, how rough it is, the dark colors and the grays, and there's nothing flashy. So it's always this constantly spooky vibe. And so a tip to have for when creating UX is to figure out what type of experience you want to have in mind before you sort of delve and create your UI. So do we want it to be spooky, adventurous, competitive? And based on the type of experience that you want to create for your user, you can sort of create your UI around that. So for example, if we look at Doki Doki Literature Club, the first impression we get is that it's a very cutesy, like anime type style game, but their game actually juxtaposes this vibe from the horror in the second half of the game. So that's definitely something that you can be creative with in your own game. And your UI should also be quick to interact with because people have short attention spans. Like a lot of us are like Dory, okay? So you want to engage your users quickly in your UI and make it very clear what's supposed to be going on and what exactly your user is doing at that moment. So for example, in the screenshot, we have these actions that are highlighted and specific instructions for what you can do and what keys to press in order to complete that. And so it's very easy, very simple, and you want to do this in your UI so that it's easiest to play for your users. Again, keep it super simple because a lot of us are smooth brains, and please consider your UI. And if it's not necessary, maybe consider taking it out because we don't want to overwhelm the user. And a really great example of UI is, or super simple UI is from Mario Kart, because every single element used here is important and very easy to understand what it's used for. For example, coins, the lap that you're on, the mini map, everything is very intuitive and it's very simple. It's not too overwhelming. So something else we want to do is to teach through gameplay. And we want to blend the UI with gameplay because this just makes the whole overall experience of learning your game much easier because we don't want to be reading a manual in order to learn how to play a game. And so if needed, definitely have a tutorial level, but we just want to make your game as easy to learn and play as possible. Again, we want to have a theme. So making sure that your UI matches the overall theme of your game is really important, and it helps to make the overall vibe very comfortable. And sticking to a color palette is a great way to achieve a cohesive theme. So as we can see here in Stardew Valley, we have some very warm colors that are brown and orangish, and it gives you a very warm aesthetic vibe. And consistency is key. The art style should be consistent in your game. So you want to have the same font, the same color palettes, and themes. So Fall Guys does this. As you can see, the buttons and icons up here, they share the same colors as the other elements in the game. And overall, this makes it much more, pleasant to look at than having a whole bunch of random different colors. We also want to guide the user's eyes. So we want to use art concepts to sort of guide the player and how they view things. So if you studied art, we know that there's sort of a hierarchy that we want to place things in. And depending on how important something is, we want to edit the way that they look based on that. So ways that we can use art concepts is to outline things so that they stand out or have color theory. And for example, in League of Legends, the important elements are all in bright red, and the other stuff that's not as important is not colored red. And that's kind of an example of how to use color theory. But other than that, you can also use typography. So if you have important words or important statements, put them in bold. And if it's not as important, then keep the text smaller. And all right, so that's all we have. And so here's a quick recap of what we've learned. So UI is user interface, and it's present in every game. And UI can be categorized into the 4 categories we talked about, but it does not have to be restricted to those categories. And I also went over some advice for making our own UI. And so UX, on the other hand, is user experience, and it's influenced by UI and it can really make or break a game because this is the overall vibe of your game. And if you're wondering how to make and implement good UI, we have a UI lab today, and we'll be going over that later. And so this is a pretty interesting link. It's called can'tunsee.space. So if you have time, feel free to explore this on your own time. But essentially, it's sort of like a quiz, quizzing you on which UI is most correct according to whoever sort of has like these design concepts. And at first, they start off pretty easy with like pretty easy levels, but then once you get further down the road, they become really hard to spot the difference. So if you're looking for a fun design challenge, then feel free to visit this link. And that's all I have. So